Grace Zimmerman's horse collapsed beneath her in the middle of nowhere, foam dripping from its mouth and eyes rolling back, leaving her stranded under a merciless Montana sun with nothing but the clothes on her back and a canteen that had been empty since dawn. She stood over the dying animal, watching its last labored breaths, and felt the full weight of her terrible decision to flee Philadelphia without so much as a proper map or destination in mind. Just blind, desperate hope that the Western Territories would somehow save her from a marriage contract she refused to honor. The landscape around her stretched endlessly in all directions, wild grasslands giving way to rocky outcrops and distant mountains that seemed both impossibly close and unreachably far. It was late July in 1877, and the heat shimmered off the ground in waves that made the horizon dance and blur. Grace had been following what she thought was a trail toward Fort Benton for 2 days, but now she realized she might have veered off course hours ago, maybe even yesterday. Her father's map, the only one she had possessed, had blown away in a windstorm the previous afternoon, and she had watched it tumble across the prairie like a pale bird until it disappeared into a ravine. She was 22 years old and absolutely alone for the first time in her life. The realization should have terrified her more than it did, but Grace had spent so many years suffocating under her father's expectations, and her mother's disappointed sighs that this vast emptiness felt almost like freedom, even if it killed her. And it very well might. She had perhaps 2 miles worth of walking strength left in her legs, no food, no water, and no idea which direction would lead to civilization. Grace knelt beside her horse one final time, stroking its neck as the animal shuddered and went still. She whispered an apology, then forced herself to stand and survey her options. The sun told her it was mid-afternoon, which meant she had maybe 4 or 5 hours of daylight left. The mountains to the west looked like they might offer shelter, possibly even a stream, but they were far away. Too far, probably. She started walking anyway, because the alternative was sitting down and waiting to die, and Grace Zimmerman had not come this far to simply give up. Her leather boots, designed for city streets rather than wilderness hiking, already had blisters forming at the heels. Her traveling dress, a practical brown wool that had seemed so sensible back in Philadelphia, trapped heat against her skin like a furnace. She had long since removed her bonnet, letting her dark hair fall loose around her shoulders in a way that would have scandalized her mother's entire social circle. The first hour of walking passed in a haze of heat and pain. Grace's thoughts drifted to the man her father had chosen for her, a 53-year-old banker named Cornelius Bradford, who had cold hands and colder eyes. She thought about the wedding that was supposed to have taken place 3 weeks ago, the scandal her disappearance must have caused, the fury her father must have felt when he discovered her empty bedroom, and the note she had left behind. She thought about her younger sister, Sweet Mary, who had helped her pack and never breathed a word of warning to their parents. Grace hoped Mary would be all right, hoped their father's anger would not fall too heavily on her. The second hour brought hallucinations at the edges of her vision, dark spots that might have been riders or might have been nothing at all. Grace's lips were cracked and bleeding, and her tongue felt thick in her mouth. She knew the signs of heat exhaustion from a medical book she had once read in secret, knew she should find shade and rest. But there was no shade anywhere, just endless grass and rocks, and the distant mountains that never seemed to get closer. She was considering whether it might be better to lie down and wait for evening when she heard the sound of water. At first, she thought it was another hallucination, but the sound persisted, a gentle rushing somewhere off to her right. Grace changed direction immediately, stumbling over rocks and through tall grass toward the sound. And there, blessed and impossible, was a small creek cutting through a shallow ravine. She half fell, half slid down the embankment and plunged her hands into the water, bringing handful after handful to her mouth, drinking so fast she choked and coughed, but could not stop herself. The water was cold and clear and tasted like life itself. She drank until her stomach hurt, then splashed water over her face and neck, soaking the front of her dress and not caring one bit. It was only after the desperate thirst had been satisfied that Grace became aware of being watched. She froze, water dripping from her chin, and slowly turned her head to see a man standing on the opposite bank of the creek, so still she had mistaken him for part of the landscape. He was the largest human being she had ever seen, well over 6 feet tall with shoulders that seemed almost too broad to be real. His hair was dark brown and fell past his shoulders, held back from his face by a strip of leather. He wore buckskin clothing that had clearly been made by hand, and across his back was strapped a rifle that looked well used. His face was weathered and tanned, with a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of dark beard, and his eyes were a startling light blue that stood out against his sun-darkened skin. But what struck Grace most was the sheer physical presence of him, the muscles visible even through his clothing, the way he stood like he was rooted to the earth itself. He looked like something carved from the mountains, wild and powerful and completely unlike any man she had ever encountered in Philadelphia's polite society. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Grace remained on her knees in the creek, suddenly aware of how she must look, disheveled and desperate and alone. The man's expression was unreadable, his light blue eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "You are lost," he said finally. His voice was deep and rough, as if he did not use it often. Grace swallowed, tasting creek water and dust. "Yes. You are far from anywhere," he continued, still not moving from his position. "Nearest town is Fort Benton, 20 miles north." 20 miles. Grace felt her brief hope crumble. She would never make 20 miles in her condition, not before nightfall, probably not at all. "I had a horse," she said, and hated how small her voice sounded. "It died, and I lost my map." Something shifted in the man's expression, a slight softening around his eyes. "You should not be out here alone. This is hard country." "I noticed," Grace said, and was surprised to hear a note of bitter humor in her own voice. The man's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. He studied her for another moment, then made a decision she could see cross his face. "My cabin is an hour west. You can rest there tonight. I will take you to Fort Benton tomorrow." Grace knew she should be wary of strange men offering shelter, had been warned her entire life about such things, but she also knew she had no real choice. She would not survive the night out here alone, and something about this man, despite his intimidating size and wild appearance, did not frighten her the way it should have. "Thank you," she said. "I would be grateful." He nodded once, then turned and started walking along the creek bank, clearly expecting her to follow. Grace climbed out of the water, her dress heavy and dripping, and hurried after him. He moved with surprising quiet for such a large man, his long strides covering ground quickly but not so quickly that she could not keep up. "My name is Grace Zimmerman," she offered after a few minutes of silence. He glanced back at her briefly. "Marcus Montgomery." "Do you live out here alone, Mr. Montgomery?" "Just Marcus," he said. And yes, Grace wanted to ask why, wanted to ask 100 questions about what would bring a man to live in such isolation, but she was too tired and her feet hurt too much to waste breath on conversation. She focused instead on putting one foot in front of the other, on keeping Marcus's broad back in sight ahead of her. The hour he had estimated turned into nearly 2. the sun sinking lower toward the mountains and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Grace's legs trembled with exhaustion, and several times she stumbled, catching herself at the last moment. Marcus looked back each time but did not offer help, and Grace was grateful for that small mercy. She did not want to be carried like a helpless child, even if part of her desperately wanted to stop moving. When the cabin finally came into view, Grace could have wept with relief. It was small and sturdy, built from logs with a stone chimney at one end, nestled against the side of a foothill with pine trees rising behind it. A small corral held 2 horses, and there was a lean-to shelter stacked with firewood. It looked solid and permanent, not at all what she had expected from a man who seemed more wilderness than civilization. Marcus led her to the cabin door and pushed it open, standing aside to let her enter first. Grace stepped into a single large room that was surprisingly clean and organized. There was a stone fireplace on one wall, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, shelves holding supplies and books, and a bed in the corner covered with fur blankets. Herbs hung drying from the rafters, and the whole place smelled of wood smoke and pine. "Sit," Marcus said, gesturing to one of the chairs. "I will bring water." Grace sank gratefully onto the chair, her legs practically giving out beneath her. She watched as Marcus filled a metal cup from a bucket near the door and brought it to her, then turned to the fireplace and began building a fire with quick, efficient movements. His hands were large and calloused, the hands of someone who worked hard and lived rough, but his movements were surprisingly careful, almost delicate. As the fire caught and began to crackle, Marcus hung a pot of water over it to heat. He moved around the cabin with the ease of long familiarity, gathering items Grace could not quite see from her position at the table. She sipped the water he had given her and studied him more carefully now that they were in the close quarters of the cabin. He was even bigger than she had initially thought, his shoulders seeming to fill half the room. His buckskin shirt stretched across muscles that spoke of years of physical labor, and when he reached up to take something from a high shelf, she could see the play of strength in his arms and back. His hair was cleaner than she had expected, hanging loose now that he had removed the leather strip, framing a face that was younger than she had first thought. Perhaps 30 or 32, though hard living had etched lines around his eyes and mouth. "You came from the east," Marcus said, not quite a question. "Philadelphia," Grace confirmed. He glanced at her, those pale blue eyes sharp and knowing. Running from something or running to something, Grace felt her throat tighten. "The first one." Marcus nodded as if he had expected that answer. People do not come to Montana without reason, especially not women alone without maps or supplies. "It was not my finest moment of planning," Grace admitted, "but I had to leave. What were you running from?" The question was direct, without malice or judgment, and Grace found herself answering honestly. "An arranged marriage. My father sold me to a man old enough to be his brother. I could not go through with it." Marcus was quiet for a moment, stirring something in the pot over the fire. "So you chose the wilderness over a rich man's house." "I chose freedom over a gilded cage," Grace said, surprised by the heat in her own voice. "Even if that freedom killed me." Marcus turned to look at her fully then, and something in his expression had shifted, a new understanding or perhaps respect. It still might. Fort Benton is not Philadelphia. Montana is not kind to the unprepared. "I am learning that," Grace said dryly. "But I would rather take my chances with the wilderness than spend the rest of my life belonging to a man I despise." The corner of Marcus's mouth lifted in what might have been approval. He turned back to the fire and ladled something from the pot into a wooden bowl which he brought to her along with a spoon. "Eat. Venison stew. It is simple, but it is food." The stew was indeed simple, but to Grace it tasted like the finest meal she had ever eaten. She forced herself to eat slowly, even though her body screamed for her to shovel the food into her mouth as fast as possible. Marcus prepared a bowl for himself and sat at the other chair, eating in silence while the fire crackled and the light outside faded to purple twilight. "How long have you lived here?" Grace asked when she had eaten enough to take the edge off her hunger. "For years," Marcus said. "I came to Montana in '73. "Why?" He was quiet for long enough that Grace thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was even rougher than before. "I was a soldier. After the war ended, I could not go back to towns and people and noise. I needed space and quiet and nothing that reminded me of what I had seen." Grace heard the weight of old pain in his words and chose not to push further. "Do you ever go into Fort Benton?" "Once a month for supplies. Otherwise, I stay here." He gestured around the cabin. "I trap in winter, hunt for meat, keep to myself. It is a good life." "A lonely one," Grace said before she could stop herself. Marcus looked at her, and something flickered in those pale eyes. "Loneliness is better than some alternatives." They finished eating in silence. Grace's exhaustion was catching up with her now that she was warm and fed, her eyelids growing heavy despite her best efforts to stay alert. Marcus noticed and stood, clearing away the bowls. "You take the bed," he said. "I will sleep outside." "I cannot take your bed," Grace protested. "This is your home." "You are injured and exhausted," Marcus said firmly. "You need proper rest. I have slept under worse conditions than a Montana summer night." Grace wanted to argue further, but her body was already betraying her, swaying slightly where she sat. Marcus came to her side and offered his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. His hand engulfed hers completely, rough and warm, and he pulled her gently to her feet. "Your boots," he said, looking down. "You have blisters." "They are not made for wilderness walking," Grace admitted. Marcus guided her to the bed and knelt down, beginning to unlace her boots with surprising gentleness. Grace felt her face heat at the intimacy of the gesture, but she was too tired to protest. He removed the boots carefully and examined her feet with a critical eye. "Bad but not terrible," he pronounced. He went to his shelves and came back with a small tin. "Salve, it will help." He rubbed the salve into her blistered feet with those large, careful hands, and Grace bit her lip against both the pain and the strange sensation of being tended to by this rough mountain man. When he was finished, he stood and backed away, giving her space. "Sleep," he said. "Tomorrow I will take you to Fort Benton. You will be safe there." Grace crawled under the fur blankets, which were softer and warmer than anything she had expected. "Thank you, Marcus, for everything. You saved my life today." He paused at the door, looking back at her. In the firelight, his face seemed less harsh, almost gentle. "Sleep well, Grace Zimmerman." He left, closing the door quietly behind him, and Grace was alone in the cabin with just the crackling fire for company. She should have felt afraid or at least cautious, but instead she felt oddly safe. There was something about Marcus Montgomery, something steady and trustworthy beneath his wild exterior, that made her believe he would do exactly as he promised. She fell asleep almost immediately, dropping into darkness like a stone into deep water. Grace woke to the smell of coffee and frying meat. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure where she was or why everything hurt. Then memory returned. The dead horse, the endless walking, the creek, Marcus. She sat up slowly, her body protesting every movement, and saw that pale morning light was streaming through the cabin's single window. The door opened and Marcus entered, carrying a plate of food. He looked like he had slept well despite spending the night outside, his hair pulled back again, and his face clean-shaven. Grace realized with a start that without the beard, He looked younger and somehow even more striking, his strong features cleanly defined. "Good morning," he said, bringing her the plate. "We should leave soon if we want to reach Fort Benton before dark." Grace accepted the food and ate quickly, suddenly nervous about the coming journey. Fort Benton meant people and questions and figuring out what came next. She had not thought beyond escaping Philadelphia, had no real plan for her life beyond running away from the one she did not want. "What will you do in Fort Benton?" Marcus asked, as if reading her thoughts. "I am not certain," Grace admitted. "Find work, I suppose. I can read and write and do arithmetic. Perhaps someone needs a bookkeeper or a teacher." Marcus looked skeptical. "Fort Benton is rough. Not many proper jobs for women." "Then I will find improper ones," Grace said with more confidence than she felt. "I did not come this far to give up now." That almost smile crossed his face again. "No, I suppose you did not." They set out an hour later, Grace riding one of Marcus's horses while he walked alongside, leading them both north toward Fort Benton. The horse was a gentle mare, and Grace, who had learned to ride as a child, found her seat easily despite her sore muscles. The morning was cool and clear, the heat of the previous day not yet risen, and the Montana landscape stretched out around them in rolling waves of grass and stone. Marcus set a steady pace, neither fast nor slow, and Grace found herself watching him as they traveled. He moved with the same quiet grace she had noticed the day before, his long legs covering ground effortlessly. He carried his rifle across his back and a knife at his belt, and his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, alert for danger she could not see. "Have you ever had trouble out here?" she asked. "With wild animals or hostile people?" "Some," Marcus said. "Bears mostly, and one bad winter when wolves came down from the mountains. People leave me alone. I stay far enough from the trails that I do not attract attention." "Until I came stumbling into your creek," Grace said. "Until that," he agreed, glancing up at her. In the morning light, his eyes were even more striking, pale blue like winter ice. "You are lucky I was checking my traps. I do not usually range that far south." "Divine providence," Grace said lightly, though she was unsure if she actually believed in such things anymore. Her faith had taken a beating along with everything else in recent months. They traveled in comfortable silence for a while, the sun climbing higher and the temperature rising. Grace was grateful for the horse, knowing she could never have made this journey on foot in her condition. Her feet still ached from yesterday's ordeal, and new pains had joined the old as her body processed everything it had been through. Around midday, they stopped at another creek to water the horses and rest. Marcus produced strips of dried meat and hard biscuits from his pack, which they ate sitting in the shade of a large boulder. Grace found herself reluctant to continue, to reach Fort Benton and lose the strange peace of Marcus's company. "Will you stay in town long?" she asked, not quite looking at him. "Long enough to see you settled," Marcus said. "Then I will get my supplies and head back." "You do not have to see me settled," Grace said quickly. "You have already done more than enough." Marcus looked at her steadily. "I am not leaving you alone in Fort Benton with no money and no plan. That would be sending a lamb into wolves." "I am not a lamb," Grace protested, stung. "No," Marcus agreed, surprising her. "You are tougher than you look. But you are still new to this territory, and Fort Benton is not a place for innocents." Grace wanted to argue that she was not an innocent either, that life in Philadelphia had taught her plenty about the ugliness people were capable of, but she recognized the futility. In this place, with its different rules and dangers, she was as naive as a child. "What is Fort Benton like?" she asked instead. Marcus considered. "Rough, growing. It is a river port town, so there is always traffic, always people coming and going." Fur traders and miners and settlers heading further west. There are saloons and supply stores and a few decent people among the not decent ones. You will need to be careful." The way he said it, the concern underlying his rough words, made Grace's chest tighten with an unfamiliar warmth. This man who barely knew her, who had every reason to leave her to her own fate, was instead protecting her like she was something precious. "Why are you helping me?" she asked quietly. Marcus was silent for a long time, staring out across the landscape. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Because you remind me that there are still people in the world brave enough to choose freedom even when it is hard, and because no one should face this country alone." Grace felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. She had not cried through any of this, not when fleeing Philadelphia, not when her horse died, not through the desperate thirst and pain of yesterday. She would not cry now from simple kindness. They reached Fort Benton late in the afternoon, the town sprawling along the banks of the Missouri River like something that had grown organically rather than been planned. Grace could see the river traffic Marcus had mentioned, boats and barges tied up at wooden docks, men loading and unloading cargo. Buildings lined unpaved streets in various states of construction and repair, from solid brick structures to rough wood storefronts, to canvas tents serving as temporary businesses. The town bustled with activity, men and horses and wagons moving in all directions. The noise and commotion a sharp contrast to the quiet spaces Grace had moved through for the past days. She felt suddenly overwhelmed, her brief time in the wilderness having already changed her in ways she did not fully understand. Marcus led them to a stable where he left the horses, then guided Grace toward what he said was the town's only boarding house. They drew stairs as they walked, Marcus because of his size and wild appearance, Grace because she clearly did not belong, her dirty traveling dress and sunburned face marking her as someone new and possibly foolish. The boarding house was run by a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Callahan, who looked at Grace with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Marcus explained the situation in his rough, economical way, and Mrs. Callahan's expression softened slightly. "I have a small room available," she said to Grace. $3 a week, meals included. "But I will need payment in advance." Grace felt her stomach sink. She had some money sewn into the lining of her dress, emergency funds she had taken from her father's study before fleeing, but it was not much, and she had hoped to preserve it as long as possible. "How much does she need for 2 weeks?" Marcus asked before Grace could speak. $6, Mrs. Callahan said, "but like I said, I need it now." Marcus reached into a pocket and produced coins, counting them out onto Mrs. Callahan's desk. Grace watched in shock and growing distress. "Marcus, no," she protested. "You cannot pay for me. I have some money." "Save it," Marcus said flatly. "You will need it." But he looked at her and his expression was kind but firm. "Let me do this." Grace wanted to argue, wanted to insist on her independence, but she also knew he was right. She would need every penny she had, and Marcus clearly could spare the cost without hardship. Still, it felt wrong to take so much from him. "I will pay you back," she said quietly. "If you wish," Marcus said, though his tone suggested he had no expectation of it. Mrs. Callahan showed Grace to a small room on the second floor, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a washstand, but it was clean and private and had a window overlooking the street. Grace stood in the doorway and felt another wave of overwhelming gratitude for Marcus's help. He waited in the hallway, seeming too large for the narrow space, his shoulders nearly touching both walls. When Mrs. Callahan had returned downstairs, Grace turned to him. "Thank you," she said, knowing the words were insufficient. "For everything. For saving my life and bringing me here and paying for the room. I do not know how to repay you." Marcus shifted slightly, looking uncomfortable with her gratitude. "You do not need to repay anything, just be safe. Be careful. Fort Benton can be dangerous for women alone." "I will be careful," Grace promised. "Will you leave right away? Go back to your cabin tomorrow morning," Marcus said. "I need to get supplies first." Grace felt an irrational surge of relief that he would be in town one more night. "Will I see you before you go?" Something flickered in his pale eyes. "If you wish." "I do wish," Grace said firmly. Marcus nodded slowly. "Then I will come by in the morning before I leave." He turned to go, and Grace felt a sudden desperate need to keep him there, to hold on to this connection with the first person in this wild territory who had shown her kindness. But she did not know what to say, how to express the tangle of feelings in her chest, so she simply watched as he walked away, his heavy footfalls echoing down the wooden stairs. Grace spent the rest of the afternoon washing and attempting to make herself presentable. Mrs. Callahan brought up a basin of hot water and some soap, and Grace scrubbed away days' worth of dirt and sweat, wincing as the water found every scratch and blister. She washed her hair as best she could and combed out the tangles, then examined her traveling dress with dismay. It was filthy and torn in several places, utterly ruined. She had one other dress in the small bag she had brought from Philadelphia, a simple blue cotton that had been folded so tightly it was nothing but wrinkles. Grace hung it by the window and hoped it would smooth out, then wrapped herself in the thin blanket from the bed and sat on the narrow mattress, suddenly unsure what to do with herself. The window showed her the street below, the constant movement of Fort Benton's daily life. She watched men on horseback and women in practical dresses, children running between buildings and dogs sleeping in patches of shade. It was so different from Philadelphia's ordered streets and proper society, raw and chaotic, and somehow more alive. Grace thought about Marcus returning to his cabin, to his solitary life in the wilderness, and felt an unexpected pang of loss. She barely knew the man, had spent less than a day in his actual company, but something about him had reached past all her carefully constructed walls. Maybe it was how he had looked at her without judgment, or how his hands had been so gentle tending her blisters, or simply that he had appeared exactly when she needed saving most. She told herself she was being foolish, that gratitude and attraction were not the same thing, that a man who lived alone in the mountains was not someone to build fantasies around. But the feelings remained, stubborn and insistent, lodging somewhere in her chest where logic could not quite reach them. Dinner in Mrs. Callahan's boarding house was a communal affair, served at a long table in the dining room with the other residents. Grace met 3 other women, all older than her, who made their living in Fort Benton through various respectable means. There was also a young man named Thomas who worked at the general store, and an elderly gentleman called Mr. Peterson, who seemed to spend most of his time smoking a pipe and reading newspapers that were months out of date. They were all curious about Grace, asking questions she answered as vaguely as possible. She was from the East, she said. She had come west for a fresh start. No, she did not have family in Montana. Yes, she was looking for work. The women exchanged glances that Grace could not quite interpret, and Mrs. Callahan pursed her lips thoughtfully. "What sort of work can you do?" one of the women asked. Her name was Dorothy, and she worked as a seamstress. "I can read and write and cipher," Grace said. "I had tutors growing up, and I have done bookkeeping for my father's business." "Can you sew?" Dorothy asked. "Basic mending and hemming, nothing elaborate. Can you cook?" "Simple things. I was never allowed in the kitchen much at home." The women exchanged glances again. Mrs. Callahan spoke up. There is not much call for bookkeepers in Fort Benton unless you want to work in the saloons keeping their records, and I would not recommend that for a young woman alone. Most women here work as seamstresses or laundresses or cooks or help run boarding houses like mine. Some teach if they are qualified. Grace felt her hopes dimming. Is there a school here? Not a formal one, Mrs. Callahan said. Father Donnelly at the church teaches some of the children when he has time, but he is not paid for it. The town has been talking about hiring a proper teacher for years, but it never comes to anything. What about the general store? Grace asked, looking at young Thomas. Or other businesses? Thomas shook his head. Old man Hendricks, who runs the store, would never hire a woman for anything but cleaning. He is particular about that. Grace felt the walls of her limited options closing in. She had not escaped one trap just to find herself in another, but Fort Benton was clearly not Philadelphia. The opportunities for women were narrow and hard. I will figure something out, she said with determination she did not quite feel. I did not come this far to fail. Dorothy smiled at her, not unkindly. You have spirit. That is good. You will need it here. After dinner, Grace returned to her small room and stood at the window, watching the sun set behind the mountains in a blaze of orange and gold. Somewhere out there, Marcus was preparing to spend another night in town before returning to his solitary life. Grace wondered if he was thinking about her at all, or if she was already forgotten, just another lost traveler he had helped and moved on from. She went to bed early, exhausted despite having ridden rather than walked for most of the day. The narrow bed was less comfortable than Marcus's cabin, the sounds of the town filtering through the thin walls, but eventually, Grace slept. She woke early to pale morning light and dressed quickly in her blue cotton dress, which had smoothed out enough to be presentable if not elegant. Grace pinned up her hair as neatly as she could manage without proper tools, then waited nervously for Marcus to arrive, sitting on the edge of her bed and watching the street below. He came an hour after sunrise, standing in Mrs. Callahan's entrance hall looking massive and out of place among the civilized furnishings. Grace hurried downstairs before Mrs. Callahan could intercept him with questions, and Marcus turned as she approached, his pale blue eyes taking in her changed appearance. You look recovered, he said. I feel better, Grace confirmed. Thank you again for the room. Marcus nodded, then glanced toward the door. Walk with me. I need to get supplies before I leave. Grace agreed immediately, grateful for any excuse to spend more time in his presence. They left the boarding house together, stepping out into the morning bustle of Fort Benton. Marcus led her toward the general store, his long strides adjusted to match her shorter ones. Did you sleep well? He asked. Well enough. And you? I am used to sleeping anywhere, Marcus said, which was not quite an answer. Have you thought more about work? Grace made a frustrated sound. There does not seem to be much available. Mrs. Callahan says most women here sew or cook or clean, and I am not skilled at any of those things. Marcus was quiet for a moment. You could teach. There is no school. Then start one, Marcus said simply. There are children here who need education. Convince their parents to pay you. Even small amounts add up. Grace looked at him in surprise. It was so practical, and yet she had not thought of it herself. Do you think parents would agree to that? Some would. Not everyone wants their children growing up without learning. Marcus paused, then added, I would have given much to have proper schooling when I was young. There was something in his voice that suggested old pain, old deprivation, and Grace filed that information away carefully. Marcus Montgomery had not come from privilege, that much was clear. The general store was crowded with customers, and Marcus moved through them with single-minded purpose, selecting supplies from the shelves and piling them on the counter. Grace watched as he purchased flour and coffee and ammunition, dried beans and salt and tobacco, all the necessary items for sustaining himself in isolation. The proprietor, presumably the Mr. Hendricks that Thomas had mentioned, added up the totals with a practiced eye. While Marcus paid, Grace wandered to a corner of the store where bolts of fabric and sewing supplies were kept. She had no money for such things, but looking cost nothing. Her fingers traced the edge of a simple calico print, and she thought about Dorothy's question regarding sewing. Perhaps she could learn if she applied herself. Grace had always been a quick study when motivated. "You need fabric?" Marcus asked from behind her, and Grace jumped slightly. "No, I was just looking." Marcus studied her for a moment, then turned back to the counter and had a quiet conversation with Mr. Hendricks. Before Grace could ask what he was doing, Marcus had purchased 3 yards of the calico along with thread and needles, adding it to his pile of supplies. "Marcus, no," Grace protested as he handed her the wrapped fabric. "You have already done too much." "You need a practical dress," Marcus said firmly. "That blue thing is too fine for this place. It will get ruined. Mrs. Callahan or one of the other women can help you sew something simpler." Grace wanted to argue, but he was right. Her blue dress would not survive long under Montana conditions, and the calico would make a perfectly serviceable work dress if she could figure out how to construct one. "Thank you," she said quietly, accepting the package. "I will pay you back for everything. I promise." Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, but instead he just nodded. They left the store with his supplies packed into a large sack he carried easily over one shoulder and walked slowly back toward the boarding house. Grace felt each step like a countdown, the minutes until Marcus left ticking away too quickly. When they reached Mrs. Callahan's front steps, Marcus set down his pack and turned to face Grace fully. In the morning light, with his hair pulled back and his expression serious, he looked younger and more vulnerable than she had seen him yet. "Be careful," he said. "Trust your instincts about people. If something feels wrong, it probably is." "I will be careful," Grace promised, "and eat properly." "You are too thin." Grace felt a smile tug at her mouth despite the heaviness in her chest. "Yes, Marcus." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was gentle and intimate, and Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You are strong," Marcus said quietly. "Stronger than you know. You will be all right here." "Will I see you again?" Grace asked, unable to stop herself. "You said you come to town once a month for supplies." Something shifted in Marcus's expression, hope and hesitation warring in those pale eyes. "Would you want to see me again?" "Yes," Grace said without hesitation. "Very much." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying her face like he was trying to memorize it. Then, so softly she almost missed it, he said, "Then I will come back." He picked up his pack, settled it on his shoulder, and walked away without looking back. Grace watched until he disappeared around a corner, her heart beating too fast and her hands clutching the wrapped fabric like a lifeline. She had known him for barely 2 days. It was absurd to feel this much about someone who was essentially a stranger. But Grace could not deny the truth settling into her bones. Marcus Montgomery had not just given her directions to Fort Benton. He had given her something to look forward to, a reason to measure the days until his return. The next 4 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Grace threw herself into establishing a life in Fort Benton with the same determination that had carried her away from Philadelphia. She convinced Mrs. Callahan to teach her basic sewing, and together with Dorothy, they constructed a simple dress from Marcus's calico that was far more practical than anything Grace had owned before. She hemmed it too short by Philadelphia standards, letting it fall just to her boot tops, but it allowed her to move freely, and that mattered more than propriety now. Grace also began asking around about teaching. She spoke to parents in the street, visited the church to talk with Father Donnelly, and eventually convinced 6 families to pay her 50 cents per week each to teach their children reading, writing, and arithmetic. It was not much money, but it was something, and more families expressed interest once word spread that an educated Eastern woman was offering lessons. She held classes in the church 3 days a week, teaching children who ranged from 5 to 14. Some were eager to learn. Others clearly attended only because their parents forced them, but Grace found she enjoyed the work more than she had expected. There was satisfaction in watching comprehension dawn in a child's eyes, in seeing them master letters and numbers they had struggled with days before. The other boarding house residents became, if not quite friends, then friendly acquaintances. Dorothy taught Grace more about sewing and offered her small mending jobs to supplement her teaching income. Mrs. Callahan proved to be less stern than she first appeared, occasionally bringing Grace extra food or refusing to charge for some small service. Even old Mr. Peterson, who rarely spoke to anyone, nodded approvingly when he learned Grace was teaching. But through it all, Grace thought about Marcus. She counted days in her head, wondering when a month would be up, when he might return to town for supplies. She imagined him in his cabin, tending his traps and hunting his meat and living his solitary life, and wondered if he thought of her at all, or if she had been simply one more lost traveler he had helped and forgotten. 28 days after Marcus had left, Grace was teaching an afternoon class when she looked up from helping a young girl with her letters and saw him standing at the back of the church. Her heart performed an impossible flip in her chest, and she nearly dropped the slate she was holding. Marcus looked exactly as he had when he left, perhaps slightly more weathered, his buckskin clothes showing signs of hard use. But those pale blue eyes were focused entirely on her, and the expression on his face made Grace's breath catch. She forced herself to finish the lesson, though her hands shook slightly and she had to repeat herself twice. When she finally dismissed the children, they stampeded out of the church with the enthusiasm of youth-granted freedom, and Grace found herself suddenly alone with Marcus in the quiet space. "Hello," she said, aware of how inadequate the word was. "Hello, Grace." Marcus moved toward her slowly, as if approaching something that might spook and bolt. "I hope it is all right that I came. I was not sure if you truly wanted to see me again or if you were just being polite." "I wanted to see you," Grace said firmly. "I have been counting the days." Something in Marcus's expression eased tension she had not noticed draining away. "I have thought about you, about whether you were safe, if you found work." "I am teaching," Grace said, gesturing around the church. 6 families pay me to educate their children. It is not much money, but it is enough to get by, and I learned to sew a practical dress." She gestured to the calico dress she wore, and Marcus's eyes traveled over her, taking in the changes. Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks under his scrutiny. "You look well," he said. "Stronger than when I left you." "I feel stronger," Grace admitted. "This place is changing me, I think, or maybe I am just becoming who I was always meant to be." Marcus smiled then, a real full smile that transformed his face from handsome to devastating. Grace felt her heart perform another impossible flip. "Would you walk with me?" Marcus asked. "I brought the supplies I purchased back to the stable, but I am in no hurry to return to the cabin." Grace agreed immediately, gathering her few teaching materials and following Marcus out of the church. They walked through Fort Benton streets, drawing fewer stares than they had a month ago. Grace had become familiar enough that people no longer marked her as a complete newcomer, and Marcus, while still obviously wild, was simply accepted as one of the mountain men who occasionally came to town. They ended up at the river, watching the boats move lazily on the current. Marcus told her about his month, about a bear that had raided his food stores and the trap line he had been running. Grace told him about her students, about learning to sew and mend, about the small victories and frustrations of building a new life. "I am proud of you," Marcus said quietly, "for making this work. Many would have given up and gone back east." "I cannot go back," Grace said. "My father would never forgive me for the embarrassment I caused, and even if he would take me back, it would only be to marry me off to someone else. I am permanently ruined in Philadelphia society." "Then Philadelphia society is foolish," Marcus said firmly. "You are not ruined. You are brave and strong, and you deserve better than to be sold like property." Grace felt tears prick her eyes at his words, at the absolute conviction in his voice. "Thank you for believing that." They sat in silence for a while, watching the river flow past. Grace wanted to ask Marcus to stay longer, to not disappear back into the wilderness for another month, but she had no right to make such demands. He had his life, and she was still figuring out what hers would look like. "Will you have dinner with me?" Marcus asked suddenly. "At the hotel dining room. It is not fancy, but the food is decent." Grace turned to look at him in surprise. "Like a proper dinner, together?" "Yes," Marcus said, and there was something vulnerable in his expression. "If you would like that." "I would like that very much," Grace said softly. They ate at the hotel that evening, sitting across from each other at a small table while other diners cast curious glances their way. Marcus had cleaned up, washing away the trail dust and pulling his hair back neatly. And in the lamplight of the dining room, he was striking enough to draw admiring looks from several women. But his attention remained fixed on Grace, listening as she talked about her students and asking thoughtful questions. Grace found herself telling him things she had not shared with anyone else, about her sister Mary and the guilt she felt for abandoning her, about the suffocating expectations of her Philadelphia life, about the terror and exhilaration of finally choosing herself. Marcus listened without judgment, his pale eyes steady and understanding. When she finally ran out of words, Marcus shared more of his own story. He had grown up poor in Missouri, joined the army at 17, and fought through the closing years of the war. The things he had seen had broken something in him, he said, made it impossible to return to normal life afterward. He had drifted west, working various jobs, until he found the land where his cabin now stood and decided to stop moving. "I thought I would live alone for the rest of my life," Marcus said quietly. "I thought that was what I wanted, what I needed." "And now?" Grace asked, barely breathing. Marcus reached across the table and took her hand, his rough fingers gentle against hers. "Now I am not so certain. These past 4 weeks, all I could think about was getting back to Fort Benton. Back to you. I told myself it was just to check that you were safe, but that was not the whole truth." Grace's heart pounded so hard she thought it might break free from her chest. "What is the whole truth?" "That you have gotten under my skin somehow," Marcus said, his thumb stroking over her knuckles. "That I find myself thinking about what it might be like to not be alone anymore, if you were interested in such a thing." Grace felt like she could not get enough air, like the room had gotten too hot and too bright all at once. "I am interested," she managed, "very much interested." Marcus's smile was slow and warm and full of promise. "Then I will come back to Fort Benton more often. Once a week instead of once a month, if that would please you." "It would please me," Grace said, feeling joy bubble up in her chest like champagne, "though the ride must be difficult to make it so often." "I have made rides for worse reasons," Marcus said. "This would be no hardship." They stayed at the hotel dining room until the staff began extinguishing lamps, talking about everything and nothing, hands linked across the table. When Marcus finally walked Grace back to the boarding house, the stars were brilliant overhead, and the town had quieted to just scattered voices and distant piano music from the saloons. At Mrs. Callahan's front steps, Marcus pulled Grace close, his large hands settling gently on her waist. "May I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough with want but still careful, still asking permission. "Please," Grace whispered. Marcus bent his head and kissed her softly, almost reverently, as if she were something precious that might break. His lips were warm and firm, and Grace felt the kiss all the way down to her toes. When he pulled back, she made a small sound of protest that made him smile. "I will be back in 1 week," he promised. "Can you wait that long?" "I will count the days," Grace said, echoing her earlier words. Marcus kissed her once more, less carefully this time, and Grace rose up on her toes to meet him, her hands fisting in his buckskin shirt. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "1 week," Marcus said again, backing away as if it took physical effort to leave her. "Be safe, Grace." "You too," she managed. Grace watched him disappear into the darkness, then floated up to her room in a daze of happiness. She had not known it was possible to feel this much, to want someone this intensely, to already miss them even though they had just parted. But Marcus Montgomery had awakened something in her, had made her understand what all the poetry and novels had been trying to express about love. The next 6 days passed in a strange combination of too fast and too slow. Grace threw herself into her teaching and her sewing projects, trying to stay busy enough that time would pass more quickly. She caught herself smiling at random moments, remembering Marcus's laugh or the way his eyes crinkled when he was amused. Dorothy noticed her distraction and teased her gently about it, and Grace found she did not mind. On the 7th day, Grace could barely concentrate on her lessons. She kept glancing toward the church door, expecting Marcus to appear at any moment. But he did not come during class, or during the afternoon when she returned to the boarding house, or during dinner. As evening fell and Grace began to worry that something had happened, that Marcus had changed his mind or encountered trouble, there was a knock on her door. Mrs. Callahan stood in the hallway with an amused expression. "There is a gentleman caller for you downstairs, the large mountain man who was here last week. I told him proper visiting hours are before 8 o'clock, but he looked at me like I had spoken in a foreign language." Grace laughed and hurried downstairs, finding Marcus in the parlor looking massive and uncomfortable among the delicate furniture. He stood as she entered, relief clear on his face. "I was beginning to think you were not coming," Grace said. "I was delayed by a river crossing," Marcus explained. "I am sorry for arriving so late. It does not matter. You are here now." Grace was acutely aware of Mrs. Callahan hovering in the doorway, propriety demanding she chaperone. "Would you like to sit? Or we could walk if you prefer." "Walking," Marcus said immediately, clearly more comfortable with that option. They left the boarding house and wandered through the quiet evening streets. Most of the town's activity was concentrated around the saloons now, leaving the residential areas peaceful. Marcus took Grace's hand as they walked, his fingers intertwining with hers in a way that felt both natural and thrilling. "I thought about you all week," Grace admitted. "It was difficult to concentrate on anything else." "I know the feeling," Marcus said. "I tried working on repairs to my cabin, but mostly I just counted hours until I could leave." They talked about their weeks, about Grace's students and Marcus's hunting, and the changing weather as summer shifted toward autumn. But underneath, the ordinary conversation was a current of something deeper, an awareness building between them that felt inevitable and right. "Grace," Marcus said suddenly, stopping and turning to face her. "I need to be honest with you about something." Grace felt a flutter of anxiety. "What is it?" "I am falling in love with you," Marcus said bluntly. "I think I started falling the moment I saw you kneeling in that creek, half dead from the sun but still fighting. And I know it has only been a few weeks, and I know I am not the sort of man women usually want, but I needed you to know the truth of my feelings." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were happy tears. "You think women do not want you? Marcus, you are the kindest, strongest, most honorable man I have ever met, and I am falling in love with you too. I have been since you took care of my blisters and gave me your bed and paid for my room when you had no reason to care whether I lived or died." Marcus pulled her close, cradling her face in his large hands. "I had every reason to care. You matter, Grace Zimmerman, more than I can properly express." He kissed her then, deep and hungry, and Grace kissed him back with everything she had. They were in the middle of the street, visible to anyone who cared to look, but Grace did not care. She had spent her whole life worrying about propriety and appearances, and none of it mattered anymore. The only thing that mattered was this man and this feeling and this moment. When they finally broke apart, Marcus rested his forehead against hers. "Come home with me," he said. "To my cabin. I know it is fast, I know people will talk, but I do not want to spend another week apart. I want to wake up with you beside me. I want to teach you about this country and have you teach me about books and proper grammar. I want to build a life together." Grace's heart felt like it might burst. "People will definitely talk. Mrs. Callahan will probably refuse to let me keep my room if I disappear into the mountains with a man unmarried." "Then marry me," Marcus said simply. "Right now, tonight if possible, tomorrow morning if not. Father Donnelly would do it, I think." Grace laughed through her tears. "Are you proposing to me in the middle of the street?" "I am," Marcus said, smiling. "I am proposing badly and too fast and without any of the proper courtship steps, but I am proposing. Will you marry me, Grace? Will you take a chance on a rough mountain man who loves you more than he knows how to say?" Grace thought about Philadelphia, about the life she had fled, and the expectations she had rejected. She thought about her father's plans for her and the cold banker who would have been her husband. She thought about safe choices and proper behavior and all the ways she was supposed to be. Then she looked at Marcus, at his honest eyes and gentle hands, and the way he looked at her like she was something miraculous, and the choice was easy. "Yes," Grace said, "I will marry you. Tomorrow morning if Father Donnelly will do it." Marcus let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and lifted her off her feet, spinning her around right there in the street. Grace clung to his shoulders and laughed with pure joy, feeling lighter and freer than she had in her entire life. Father Donnelly married them the next morning in the small church, where Grace taught her lessons. Mrs. Callahan attended as a witness, along with Dorothy and several of Grace's students who happened to be nearby. It was not a fancy ceremony, no elaborate dress or flowers or reception, but Grace thought it was perfect. Marcus spoke his vows in that rough voice that made her shiver, promising to love and protect and honor her, and Grace promised the same, her voice clear and strong. When Father Donnelly pronounced them husband and wife, Marcus kissed her so thoroughly that Dorothy had to clear her throat loudly to remind them they had an audience. Grace blushed, but could not stop smiling. They spent one more night in Fort Benton, in the hotel's best room, which Marcus insisted on paying for despite Grace's protests that they could have saved the money. But Marcus wanted their wedding night to be special, to have privacy and comfort rather than rushing off into the wilderness immediately. Grace lay in Marcus's arms that night, her head on his broad chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. His hands traced patterns on her back, gentle and reverent, and she had never felt so safe and wanted in her entire life. "Are you certain about coming to the cabin?" Marcus asked quietly. "It is isolated and rough. There are no neighbors, no shops, no churches nearby. Just wilderness and weather and hard work." "I am certain," Grace said. "I did not flee Philadelphia just to recreate it somewhere else. I want the wilderness. I want the challenge. And most of all, I want you." Marcus tightened his arms around her. "You have me, for as long as you want me." "Forever then," Grace said simply. They left Fort Benton 2 days later, after Grace had said goodbye to her students and arranged for Father Donnelly to take over their lessons until they could figure out a more permanent solution. Several of the families had been disappointed to lose their teacher, but understanding when Grace explained she was marrying and moving to her husband's cabin. Dorothy had helped her pack her few belongings and hugged her tightly, making Grace promise to visit Fort Benton occasionally. The ride to Marcus's cabin took most of a day, following trails that Grace would never have found on her own. Marcus rode beside her on his own horse, occasionally pointing out landmarks or wildlife. Grace felt a mix of excitement and nervousness about her new life, but underneath it all was certainty. This was right. Marcus was right. When the cabin finally came into view, nestled against the hillside with mountains rising behind it, Grace felt a sense of homecoming that surprised her. This rough structure was more welcoming than the Philadelphia mansion she had grown up in, and she knew it was because Marcus lived here, because they would build their life together within these walls. Marcus helped her down from her horse and pulled her close, kissing her temple. "Welcome home, Mrs. Montgomery." Grace smiled at the name, at the way it sounded both strange and perfect. "Show me everything. I want to learn it all." The next weeks were a steep learning curve. Marcus taught Grace how to handle the horses and maintain the cabin and preserve meat for winter. He showed her his trap lines and how to identify edible plants and where the best fishing spots were on the nearby streams. Grace proved to be a quick study, throwing herself into learning with the same determination she had shown in Fort Benton. In return, Grace taught Marcus things he had never learned growing up poor and enlisting young. She read to him in the evenings from the books he had collected over the years, helped him improve his reading skills until he could manage even complex texts. She brought structure to the cabin's disorganization, setting up systems for supplies and food storage that made everything more efficient. But more than the practical lessons, they learned each other. Grace learned that Marcus was an early riser who liked to watch the sunrise with coffee in hand. She learned that he had a quiet sense of humor that revealed itself in unexpected moments, and that he was surprisingly sentimental, keeping small tokens from meaningful occasions. She learned that he loved physical affection, craved touch in a way that suggested he had been starved for it during his solitary years. Marcus learned that Grace was fierce when challenged and stubborn about things that mattered to her. He learned that she talked in her sleep and always woke up cold, burrowing into him for warmth. He learned that she was braver than she gave herself credit for, facing down challenges that would have sent many running back to civilization. He learned that her smile was the best part of any day, and that making her laugh felt like winning a prize. As autumn deepened and the weather grew colder, they prepared for winter together. Marcus hunted deer and elk, and Grace learned to butcher and preserve the meat. They gathered firewood until the lean-to shelter was stacked full, and then started a second pile. Marcus insulated the cabin's walls with extra layers of bark and moss, and Grace sewed heavy curtains for the windows to keep out drafts. The first snow came in late October, a light dusting that melted by afternoon but signaled what was coming. Grace stood in the doorway watching the flakes fall, and Marcus came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on top of her head. "Are you sorry you came?" he asked quietly. "Winter here is long and hard. We will be snowed in for months." Grace turned in his arms to face him. "I am not sorry. I have never been less sorry about anything in my life. I have you, and that is all I need." Marcus kissed her softly. "I love you." "I love you too," Grace said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Winter did come with a vengeance, just as Marcus had warned. By November, snow lay thick on the ground and temperatures dropped well below freezing. They spent most days inside the cabin, venturing out only for necessary chores like tending the horses or checking trap lines. The isolation would have driven Grace mad back when she first arrived in Montana, but now, with Marcus, it felt like a gift. They had long conversations and comfortable silences, made love by firelight and read books aloud while storms raged outside. In December, Grace realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but waited to be certain before telling Marcus. When she finally shared the news one evening after dinner, Marcus's face transformed with wonder and joy. "A baby," he repeated, as if he could not quite believe it. "We are going to have a baby." "In late spring or early summer, I think," Grace said, watching his reaction carefully. They had not discussed children, had barely been married 4 months. She hoped he was ready. Marcus pulled her into his lap, cradling her like she was made of glass. "This is the best thing anyone has ever told me. A family. An actual family." His voice broke slightly on the last words, and Grace realized he was crying, tears sliding down his weathered cheeks. "Are those happy tears?" she asked, though she thought she knew the answer. "So happy," Marcus said. "I never thought I would have this. A wife who loves me, a child on the way, a home that feels like more than just a place to sleep. You have given me everything I did not know I needed." Grace kissed his tears away and held him tight, feeling her own eyes well up. "You gave me freedom," she whispered. "And safety and love and a purpose beyond being ornamental. We saved each other, Marcus." They sat together by the fire, wrapped in each other and dreams of the future, while outside the snow continued to fall. Winter gradually released its grip, as February turned to March and March to April. The snow melted in patches, revealing grass underneath, and the creek that ran near their cabin swelled with runoff. Grace's belly grew round and prominent, and Marcus treated her like she might shatter at any moment, constantly fussing and trying to prevent her from doing any work. "I am pregnant, not dying," Grace told him one afternoon when he tried to stop her from sweeping the cabin floor. "I need to move around. I will go crazy if you make me sit still for the next 3 months." "I just want you to be safe," Marcus protested. "You and the baby." "We will be safe," Grace promised. "But I need to be useful too. Let me do small things at least." They compromised, Marcus taking on the heaviest chores while Grace handled lighter tasks. They made a cradle together from wood Marcus carefully shaped and smoothed until there were no rough edges. Grace sewed tiny clothes from fabric they had brought back from a trip to Fort Benton in early spring, their first visit to town since before winter. That trip had been interesting. Grace was visibly pregnant, and several people had expressed surprise that the rough mountain man had convinced an educated Eastern woman to stay with him in the wilderness. But Mrs. Callahan had hugged Grace tightly and told her she looked happy and healthy, and Dorothy had given them baby clothes she had sewn as a gift. Father Donnelly had blessed Grace's belly and promised to pray for a safe delivery. As Grace's due date approached, Marcus became increasingly nervous. They were a day's hard ride from Fort Benton and any doctor or midwife, and while Grace had read everything she could find about childbirth, neither of them had practical experience. But frontier women gave birth without doctors all the time, Grace reasoned, and she was healthy and strong. They would manage. The baby came in late June, during a thunderstorm that made the cabin walls shake. Grace's labor started in the afternoon and lasted through the night, Marcus holding her hand and following her instructions with steady calm, even though she could see fear in his eyes. When their son finally arrived just before dawn, Letting out a strong, angry cry, Marcus cut the cord with shaking hands and placed the baby on Grace's chest with a reverence that made her cry. "A boy," Grace said wonderingly, studying their son's tiny features. He had dark hair like both of them and had inherited his father's strong lungs, still crying lustily about his sudden entrance into the world. "He is perfect," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are perfect. You were so brave, Grace." Grace was too exhausted to feel brave, but she smiled up at her husband. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but never quite decided. Marcus studied their son seriously. "Matthew," he said finally. "Matthew Marcus Montgomery, a strong name for a strong boy." "Matthew," Grace repeated, trying it out. "I like it." "Hello, Matthew." The baby quieted at her voice, his tiny eyes trying to focus on her face, and Grace felt her heart expand with love so fierce it almost hurt. This was her son, hers and Marcus's, the physical proof of everything they had built together. The next weeks were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Grace was amazed by how much work one tiny human could create, the constant feeding and changing and soothing. But Marcus was an involved father, taking on every task he could to give Grace time to rest and recover. He walked endless circles around the cabin at night, rocking Matthew when he fussed, singing rough lullabies in his deep voice that somehow always worked to settle the baby. Grace watched her husband transform from solitary mountain man to devoted father with wonder. Marcus would sit for hours just watching Matthew sleep, tracing his tiny fingers with one large calloused one, whispering promises about all the things he would teach him and ways he would protect him. It was clear Marcus was determined his son would have everything he himself had lacked growing up. By August, they had settled into a routine. Grace was mostly recovered from the birth, and Matthew was growing fast, alert and interested in everything around him. They made another trip to Fort Benton so people could meet the baby, and Grace's former students crowded around to see little Matthew, asking questions about whether he could talk yet, and when he would be big enough to play. Mrs. Callahan declared Matthew the most handsome baby she had seen in years, and Dorothy sewed him a beautiful christening gown. Father Donnelly baptized Matthew in the church, with half the town attending because everyone was curious about the mountain man's family. "You look happy," Dorothy said to Grace afterward, while Marcus was showing Matthew to some of the trappers who had known him for years. "Truly happy, not just pretending." "I am happy," Grace said simply. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be. No regrets about leaving Philadelphia." Grace looked across the room to where Marcus stood, their son cradled carefully in his massive arms, and felt her heart swell with love. Not even one. They returned to the cabin after a few days in town, all of them glad to be home. Marcus declared he had missed the quiet, and Grace had to admit she felt the same. She loved Fort Benton and the people there, but the cabin was where they belonged, tucked away in the wilderness with just each other and the mountains and endless sky. As Matthew grew from infant to toddler, Grace sometimes thought about her old life. She wondered if her father had forgiven her, if her sister Mary was well, if anyone in Philadelphia ever spoke of her, or if she had been completely erased from their social circles. But the thoughts came less frequently now, and with less pain. That life felt like something that had happened to a different person, a girl Grace barely recognized anymore. Her life now was so different it might have been on another planet. She wore practical dresses and boots, knew how to track animals and preserve meat, could identify dozens of edible and medicinal plants. Her hands were calloused from work, her skin tanned from sun, and she was stronger than she had ever been. She taught Matthew his letters and numbers as he grew old enough to learn, and Marcus taught him about the land and animals. and together they raised him with love and patience. They had more children over the years. A daughter named Margaret born when Matthew was 3, who had Grace's stubborn determination and Marcus's quiet strength. Then twin boys, Michael and Martin, born 2 years after Margaret, who were nothing but energy and mischief from the moment they could walk. The cabin that had seemed spacious for 2 became crowded with 4 children, so Marcus built an addition, expanding their home to accommodate their growing family. Grace sometimes got overwhelmed by the chaos of raising 4 children in the wilderness, but Marcus was always there, steady and supportive, taking on more than his share so she could have moments of peace. And on the hard days when she felt exhausted and touched out and desperate for quiet, she would remember that desperate lost woman who had arrived in Montana 6 years ago with no plan and no hope, and she would feel grateful for every single noisy, messy moment of the life she had now. The children thrived in the wilderness. Matthew became an expert tracker by age 10, able to identify animal signs Marcus sometimes missed. Margaret was fearless, climbing trees that made Grace's heart stop and exploring caves that went deeper than seemed safe. The twins were inseparable, developing their own language and getting into trouble that required both parents to handle. Every month or so, they would make the trip to Fort Benton as a family, the children riding in a wagon Marcus had built while Grace and Marcus rode their horses alongside. The town continued to grow, new buildings going up and more families settling in the area. Grace reconnected with her teaching during these visits, holding lessons in the church for any children who wanted to attend, though now she brought her own 4 to participate. Mrs. Callahan grew older but remained sharp, always having opinions about how Grace was raising the children and advice about everything from teething to discipline. Dorothy married a surveyor who came through town and had children of her own, remaining Grace's closest friend despite the distance between their homes. Father Donnelly baptized all 4 of Grace's children and declared that Grace and Marcus had proved that love could thrive anywhere, even in the wilderness. Marcus's reputation in Fort Benton evolved over the years. He was no longer just the solitary mountain man who kept to himself, but rather a devoted husband and father, a man who had built a good life in the wild places. Younger men sometimes sought his advice about trapping or hunting, and he gave it freely, though he never invited anyone to visit the cabin. That remained their sanctuary, family only. Grace wrote letters to her sister Mary over the years, sending them east with travelers heading that direction, and occasionally receiving responses. Mary had married a kind man her own choosing and had 2 children, and she reported that their father had eventually forgiven Grace, or at least stopped speaking about her with quite so much anger. Their mother had passed away 3 years after Grace left, and Mary thought the shock of Grace's disappearance had contributed to her decline, though she did not say it accusingly. Grace felt guilt about that, about the pain her choices had caused, but she could not truly regret the life she had built. She hoped her mother would have understood eventually, would have seen that Grace was happy and loved and living authentically, rather than performing the role of a dutiful daughter to an unsuitable marriage. The years passed in seasons and cycles. Harsh winters when they were snowed in for months, glorious summers when the children ran wild and free, autumns of preparation and springs of renewal. Grace taught her children to read and write and do mathematics, and Marcus taught them to hunt and trap and respect the land. Together, they raised 4 humans who were confident and capable, who knew how to work hard and also how to find joy in simple things. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Marcus surprised Grace by taking her to Fort Benton without the children, leaving them with a trapper friend who had a wife and children of his own. They spent 2 nights at the hotel, having actual privacy for the first time in years, talking and making love and remembering what it was like to be just the two of them. "You ever regret it?" Marcus asked on their last evening, as they sat in the hotel dining room over dinner. Taking a chance on a rough mountain man who could barely put together a proper proposal, Grace reached across the table to take his hand. "Never. Not once. You gave me a life I did not even know I wanted, Marcus. You gave me freedom and love and a family and a purpose." "How could I regret the best decision I ever made?" Marcus smiled, that slow, warm smile that still made her heart skip. "I found you dying of thirst in a creek and fell in love with you before we even reached my cabin. I knew you were supposed to be mine." "I was lost," Grace said softly. "In every possible way. And you gave me directions to Fort Benton, but more importantly, you gave me a reason to stay in Montana." "What was the reason?" Marcus asked, though his eyes said he knew the answer. "You," Grace said simply. "Always you." They returned to the cabin and their children, slipping back into the beautiful chaos of family life. The years continued to pass, bringing challenges and changes but also deep satisfaction. Matthew grew tall and strong like his father, eventually building his own cabin a few miles away and marrying a girl from Fort Benton. Margaret proved as stubborn as her mother, insisting on learning everything her brothers learned and refusing to accept that some things were not for girls. The twins remained close, eventually deciding to go into business together as guides for wealthy Eastern hunters who wanted to experience the wilderness. Grace and Marcus grew older together, their hair graying and their bodies showing the wear of hard living, but their love never diminished. If anything, it grew deeper and richer with each passing year, the foundation of everything they had built. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a celebration at the cabin, now expanded to include a proper dining room that could hold the whole family. Matthew brought his wife and 2 children. Margaret brought the surveyor she had been courting from Fort Benton, and the twins brought enough wild game to feed an army. Mrs. Callahan made the trip out from town, ancient now but still sharp-tongued, and Father Donnelly came to offer a blessing. Grace stood next to Marcus, surrounded by their children and grandchildren and friends, and felt overwhelming gratitude for the path her life had taken. She thought about that desperate girl who had arrived in Montana without a map, who had been so lost she would have died if not for a chance encounter at a creek. "What are you thinking about?" Marcus asked quietly, his arm around her waist. "About how lost I was," Grace said. "And how you found me." "We found each other," Marcus corrected gently. "You gave me reasons to come out of the wilderness, to let someone in, to build a life bigger than just survival. We saved each other, Grace. We always have." Grace looked up at her husband, this man who had been her salvation and her partner and her great love, and smiled. "Then I suppose we should keep saving each other for another 25 years. "At least," Marcus agreed, and kissed her while their family cheered. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and Grace Zimmerman Montgomery stood in the home she had built with the man she loved, surrounded by the family they had created, and knew with absolute certainty that every hard choice and difficult moment had been worth it. She had arrived in Montana lost and desperate, but she had found so much more than just directions. She had found herself, her purpose, and a love that would last all the days of her life. The wilderness had made her strong. Fort Benton had given her community. But Marcus had given her everything that truly mattered: love, partnership, and a reason to stay not just in Montana, but in this life they had built together, one day and one season and 1 year at a time, until lost became found and alone became family, and a chance meeting at a creek became a love story that would span decades. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, and their family gathered inside for dinner, Marcus pulled Grace close one more time, his hand finding hers with the same certainty it had all those years ago when he first offered to help a lost traveler find her way. "I love you, Grace," he said, the words as true now as they had been the first time he spoke them. "I love you too, Marcus," Grace replied, and knew she would say those same words every day for the rest of their lives, grateful beyond measure for the mountain man who had given her directions, and then given her everything else that mattered. Their story was not one of grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but rather of two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment, who had chosen each other every single day since, and who had built something lasting and real from nothing more than courage, love, and determination. It was a quiet story in many ways, played out far from the eyes of society in a wilderness cabin at the edge of civilization. But it was their story, and it was enough, more than enough. It was everything.